They never told you that Victorian men were treated in places darker than the illnesses they carried. Secrets moved through back alleys, through doors that opened only for the desperate, through bargains whispered where morality could not reach. Entire networks thrived beneath a society obsessed with purity, leaving truths buried under silence and shame. Tonight, we will step quietly into that hidden world they hoped no one would ever see. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If a man in a Victorian town felt the first sting of a secret illness, his steps rarely turned toward a hospital. He knew what waited there: questions, records, witnesses, and the quiet, merciless gaze of society. Illness carried shame only when it touched the body in forbidden ways. And for Victorian men, that shame was heavier than pain. So they walked elsewhere, down narrow lanes behind gas-lit streets, through alleys that smelled of coal dust and damp brick, toward buildings that pretended to be ordinary. These places were not marked by signs. A dim doorway, a half-closed shutter, a familiar nod from someone who recognized fear in a man's eyes. These were enough to guide him. Behind many brothels, a small staircase led to rooms no one spoke about aloud. The walls were thin, the floors uneven, and the candles burned low to hide the details. Inside, men waited in silence, not looking at one another, clutching coins that felt heavier than their own guilt. They did not want conversation. They wanted privacy. They wanted the promise that whatever happened in these rooms would never be written down, never whispered in drawing rooms, never passed from clerk to clerk in an official ledger. The women who ran these brothels understood the stakes better than anyone. They saw the tremors in a man's hands when he noticed the first rash. They recognized the way he avoided eye contact, afraid someone might guess what he carried beneath his collar. They knew the difference between fear of illness and fear of discovery. That was why many brothels kept quiet connections. Names of healers who did not ask, who accepted payment without judgment, who worked in cramped rooms lit by a single oil lamp. These healers were never announced as doctors. They lived between labels, practicing medicine in the shadows, their reputations spreading through murmured recommendations. The rooms themselves were not comforting. A narrow cot, a cracked basin, a wooden table stained by years of unspoken illness. The tools were simple: cloths, powders, and metal instruments dulled by use. Many patients tried not to look closely at what surrounded them, knowing too much might deepen the panic already tightening around their ribs. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with perfume drifting up from the rooms below. Everything about the place felt improvised, temporary, intended for men who wished to arrive unseen and leave even more quietly. Yet these hidden clinics were busy every evening. Men of all classes arrived: clerks, soldiers, merchants, even gentlemen wrapped in coats so fine they nearly glowed in the dimness. Illness made them equals. Reputation made them silent. Their coin paid not only for treatment, but also for the certainty that nothing would reach the ears of wives, employers, or police inspectors. The brothel itself offered a kind of shield. No one questioned a man seen entering, because the assumption was already shameful enough. What he did inside simply vanished into the building's private geography. Some healers used mixtures they barely understood, combining herbs with chemicals purchased cheaply from apothecaries. Others had once been military medics, accustomed to treating infections in tents, far from supervision. A few were genuine physicians who had slipped into debt or disgrace, and now worked where hospitals would not follow. Whatever their origin, they shared a common rule: they did not keep records. Paper was dangerous. Names were dangerous. Memory, however, could be trusted. Memory could not be subpoenaed. Men rarely spoke more than necessary when they sat across from these healers. Their voices were low, their eyes tense, their hands clasped as if holding themselves together. The healer usually asked only one question: how long it had been since symptoms appeared. Anything more risked pushing the patient into shame or denial. And neither emotion was useful. Treatment began quickly, almost mechanically. Cloth soaked in harsh solutions pressed against skin. Bitter liquids swallowed in one breath. Instructions whispered with urgency. Many of these remedies were painful. Some were pointless. A few were outright dangerous. But fear made men obedient. What drove them into these back rooms was not merely illness. It was the threat of being marked as immoral, unclean, and weak. Victorian society praised virtue loudly, but punished deviation with equal force. A man caught seeking treatment for a sexually transmitted disease might lose his job, his marriage, and his place in the community. A hospital visit required explanations, signatures, witnesses, and every step was a risk of exposure. The hidden clinics demanded nothing but coins. Even the journey to these rooms carried tension. A man walking through a brothel alley at night imagined every shadow looking at him, every sound judging him. He rehearsed excuses in case someone asked where he had been. No matter how many had walked the same path before him, he felt alone, carrying a secret he could not share, but could not escape. What made these places both terrifying and irresistible was the illusion they offered, the belief that a man could erase his mistake with enough money and silence. The healer's brisk movements, the brothel keeper's reassuring nod, the dimly lit room stripped of formality. All these details helped create the feeling that the problem could be sealed away, contained like a stain wiped from a wooden floor. But illnesses did not obey secrecy. They spread beneath collars and cuffs, along nerves and blood, indifferent to the shame that hid them. I find it unsettling to imagine those men sitting on creaking chairs, waiting for a door to open, each one hoping his body would obey a treatment created more for discretion than for cure. It is easy, looking back, to criticize their choices. Yet in a world where morality governed every gesture, secrecy often felt safer than science. Hospitals might have offered better care, but they offered no protection from humiliation. And humiliation, to a Victorian man, was a kind of death all its own. The brothels and their hidden clinics formed a quiet system. Imperfect, risky, but necessary for those who felt trapped between illness and reputation. These men had to choose between public judgment and private danger, knowing neither path promised safety. In those narrow back rooms, they clung to the faint hope that silence could save them. The quiet desperation that drove these men into back rooms revealed how fear ruled their search for help. Yet the world they stepped into held far more than whispered treatments and dim corridors. There were places where even the promise of silence came with a price no one dared name. A Victorian gentleman carried his reputation the way others carried their coats, kept close, carefully brushed, and never allowed to touch the dirt. Even the faintest hint of scandal could stain him in ways no soap could wash away. Illnesses of the private kind were spoken of only in metaphors, wrapped in silence so thick that men flinched at the idea of naming them aloud. For these men, dignity was currency, and once spent, it could not be earned back. That was why fear, not illness, was often the first symptom they felt. A gentleman who suspected he had contracted something dangerous did not confide in friends or family. He withdrew, moving through streets with a stiff posture, his eyes lowered, as though guilt had weight. The thought of being seen near a brothel or a discreet healer's door terrified him more than the fever under his skin. Respectability trapped him. He could not seek help without risking ruin. Yet he could not ignore the creeping signs inside his body. In drawing rooms lit by polished lamps, He pretended to be whole. Beneath the gloves and tailored coats, anxiety trembled like a hidden pulse. Society rewarded the appearance of virtue far more than the practice of it. A man's worth lay not in his kindness, but in how well he performed the role expected of him. Any misstep could unravel years of careful behavior, and the fall was quick. Neighbors whispered. Employers hesitated. Wives grew cold. Once a stain appeared, it spread faster than any infection. The gentleman knew this. He knew, too, that a single witness, one curious glance, one poorly timed sighting, could be enough to destroy him. This pressure created a kind of quiet desperation. Men walked past hospitals as though they were places of judgment rather than healing. Doctors in official institutions kept records, asked questions, and reported alarming cases to authorities. A gentleman could not risk his name being placed beside terms that polite society refused to acknowledge. Even entering such a building for an unrelated illness could provoke suspicion. Eyes watched. Rumours flourished without oxygen, needing only the faintest spark. At home, the fear deepened. A gentleman might sit at his writing desk, staring at letters he could not send, imagining the consequences of truth. He rehearsed explanations in his mind, but discarded each one. His wife must not know. His colleagues must not know. His servants, who saw more than anyone realized, must not know. He lived within a fragile bubble of pretense, hoping his body would somehow mend itself through will alone. But symptoms rarely respected pride. The shame attached to these diseases was rooted in morality rather than medicine. Victorian culture connected illness with sin, framing the afflicted as irresponsible men who had succumbed to temptation. This belief made confession impossible. To admit the infection was to admit moral failure. And so the gentleman concealed, delayed, bargained with himself. In the reflection of a polished mirror, he might search his face for clues, as though disgrace could etch itself into skin. What made the situation even more dangerous was the contrast between outward refinement and private fear. Many gentlemen cultivated images of composure and restraint, speaking softly, moving deliberately, and presenting themselves as models of propriety. Yet beneath the surface lay a frantic calculation. How long before someone noticed his discomfort? How long before rumours emerged? He learned to hide physical pain behind manners, to swallow panic behind gentle conversation about the weather or politics. Some turned to books or pamphlets, though these offered little reassurance. Many were filled with half-truths or moral warnings disguised as medical advice. Fear pushed them toward secrecy, and secrecy pushed them toward unreliable sources. A gentleman might spend nights pacing the floor, imagining symptoms worsening, imagining the consequences of discovery spreading like cracks across the life he had built. The streets themselves became threatening. Passing through certain districts, he worried that someone might interpret his presence as an intention. A single accidental pause near a brothel door could be enough to spark gossip. Even entering an apothecary for mundane medicines felt risky when the shelves also held mixtures rumoured to treat forbidden conditions. Every movement required calculation. Every decision an attempt to protect the thin shell of respectability that held his world together. I find it chilling how much of a Victorian gentleman's identity depended on the eyes of others. His fear was not of the disease itself, but of becoming a story whispered in parlour rooms. His name softened into pity or sharpened into mockery. In a society obsessed with moral appearances, suffering silently felt safer than seeking help. The illness was inside his body, but the real prison was around him. The constant pressure to maintain a spotless reputation left these men clinging to silence as their only protection. Yet the more they tried to guard their image, the deeper they slipped into places where truth had no room to breathe. And among those shadows were healers willing to offer solutions that few would dare to question. Knowledge about the body was a rare and uneasy thing in Victorian life, especially for men who were expected to understand everything, yet taught almost nothing. Households avoided such subjects entirely. Schools pretended they did not exist, and churches wrapped desire in warnings rather than explanations. A young man stepped into adulthood, knowing how to read ledgers and draft letters, but unable to name the dangers that waited in the darker corners of a city. Ignorance was not an accident, it was a social rule, upheld with pride. In this silence, myths began to bloom. Whispers travelled through taverns and workshops, carrying stories that confused curiosity with superstition. Many believed brothels possessed a strange vitality, a force that could restore health or strengthen a man's spirit. Others claimed that illness came only to the weak and that a confident man had little to fear. These ideas spread quickly because they fit neatly into a world where morality was louder than science. No one questioned what they did not understand. They simply repeated what they heard, hoping it was enough. For many men, their first encounter with, say, sexual disease came not through education but through panic. A sudden rash, a burning ache, a fever that rose without warning. These signs struck like an unspoken sentence. Confusion turned swiftly into dread. They searched their memories for guidance, but found only fragments of rumour, advice given in jest, warnings delivered half seriously, hints dropped by older men who spoke with the ambiguity of caution wrapped in pride. None of it helped. None of it prepared them. By the time symptoms appeared, the infection had already taken hold. Without knowledge, they waited, believing the discomfort might pass on its own. Days stretched into weeks. Fear hardened. Some tried home remedies, herbal mixtures, strong spirits, and cold water, none of which did more than delay the inevitable. Others kept their secrets so tightly that even the mirror became an enemy, reflecting a truth they wished they could deny. Brothels were among the few places where men shared information, though the information itself was distorted. Patrons spoke of good houses and bad houses, as though choosing the right room could protect them from disease. Some believed certain women carried a mystical charm that could purify a man, while others insisted that illness came from emotional weakness rather than physical exposure. These theories grew because they soothed fears, not because they held truth. In a world without guidance, imagination filled the void. Men clung to these myths with surprising devotion. It was easier to believe in the power of confidence than in the vulnerability of the human body. Admitting the possibility of infection meant admitting the limits of control, and Victorian masculinity had little space for such humility. So they walked into danger with a false sense of immunity, unaware that each careless decision tightened the noose around their well-being. When illness finally revealed itself, the shock was overwhelming. Panic dissolved whatever illusions remained. Some men isolated themselves, terrified of being seen. Others sought help in the dim back rooms where discretion replaced judgment. Their questions were frantic, fragmented, spoken in low voices. They asked whether the disease could vanish on its own, whether a single mistake could ruin an entire life, and whether the healer had seen someone like them before. The answers were rarely reassuring. What made the situation more tragic was how preventable much of it could have been. A few basic lessons might have spared countless men from suffering. Yet society chose silence over clarity. The emphasis on moral purity left no space for practical instruction. As a result, men stepped blindly into danger, believing themselves safe until their bodies proved otherwise. Ignorance was not harmless, it was lethal. I find it unsettling to imagine these men navigating adulthood with so many gaps in their understanding, carrying pride like a shield that protects nothing. The combination of fear, secrecy, and misunderstanding created a quiet disaster that unfolded in private rooms across the city. Each man believed he was alone, unaware that countless others were stumbling through the same darkness. The shock that came with their first symptoms exposed just how fragile their confidence truly was. Yet their confusion only pushed them further into the places where rumor replaced knowledge. Whispers in those hidden spaces hinted at a deeper influence brothels held. One man learned to seek only when fear outweighed pride. Brothels in Victorian towns existed in a strange twilight, both visible and ignored. Condemned publicly, yet relied upon privately by men from every social layer. Inside their dim corridors, business was carried out with an efficiency that had little to do with pleasure alone. Beneath the perfume, the laughter, and the rustling of silk skirts, a quieter system thrived, one that connected desperate men to the only kind of medical help they dared to seek. The brothel was never just a house of indulgence. It was an entryway into a hidden network where secrets were currency and silence was a form of treatment. Madams understood this world far better than the men who stumbled into it. Their work required more than managing women and customers. They watched faces, noted hesitations, and recognized the stiff movements of men trying to hide discomfort. They sensed when a client returned not for desire but for reassurance. They saw illness before the men admitted it to themselves. Small flinches, whispered questions, brief pauses before undressing. In these moments, the madam measured him quietly. Was he simply frightened? Or was he already carrying something dangerous? Over time, many madams kept discreet notebooks, though the entries were coded or half erased. Names of healers written only by initials. Addresses disguised as directions. Reminders of who could be trusted and who demanded too much coin. These notebooks were not for keeping records, they were for survival. A brothel's reputation depended on preventing disaster. If a man grew sick after visiting, rumors could kill the business as surely as disease killed the body. Referring him to the right healer was not kindness, it was protection. Her livelihood relied on managing risk. Some of these healers were former military medics who knew how to treat infections that soldiers carried across battlefields. Others were apothecaries who mixed powders without asking questions. A few were disgraced physicians who no longer had the right to practice openly, but still possessed knowledge sharper than any official doctor wished to acknowledge. The madam did not need to know their past. She only needed to know that they kept quiet. Men who entered brothels with uncertainty often left with directions murmured discreetly, perhaps given at the doorway or while a curtain was being drawn. A madam might tilt her head toward the back alley or mention a friend who could help with matters too delicate for daylight. No details were spoken aloud. Everything was implied, subtle, shielded by the brothel's atmosphere of mutual discretion. Clients understood that this guidance was not offered lightly. It was a lifeline wrapped in shadow. The brothel thus became an unofficial clinic in disguise, not for treatment, but for navigation. The women themselves played a part in this system. They observed more than anyone realized, catching glimpses of sores or rashes when men hurriedly undressed, noticing when a client winced at a simple touch. They warned each other quietly, passing along information the way others might exchange gossip. Some even refused certain clients unless the madam intervened, sensing danger in their condition. Their survival depended on vigilance, and their vigilance helped maintain the entire hidden network. For the men, this system felt strangely merciful. A brothel was one of the few places where their shame did not clash with the surrounding world. A man could ask vague questions without raising suspicion. The madam's nod or glance carried more reassurance than any official doctor's signature. Here, illness did not make him an outcast. It made him just another customer in need of discretion. But this arrangement also deepened their dependence. Many men returned again and again, seeking not pleasure but guidance. They trusted the madam more than their own judgment, believing she held access to knowledge denied by society. And in a way, she did. Her brothel was a crossroads where secrets intersected. Information, illness, desperation, all passing through her hands before sinking back into the city's undercurrents. Some brothels became known for their connections, not publicly, of course, but through quiet recommendations exchanged in taverns or whispered during late-night walks home. Men said, without saying, that certain houses offered more than warmth in a bed. They offered direction, protection, and a path toward healing that no official institution would grant them. These reputations never appeared in newspapers, but they mattered deeply to those who relied on them. I find it unsettling to imagine these brothels functioning as fragile bridges between fear and survival. The very places society condemned as immoral became essential to its hidden medical world. Without them, countless men would have remained lost, trapped between illness and terror, unable to step into a hospital without sacrificing their names. The quiet authority brothels, held in guiding men towards secret healers, revealed how deeply society depended on silence to manage its own failings. Yet the more these houses became way stations for the desperate, the more intricate their hidden alliances grew behind closed doors. Rumors even spoke of healers who lived entirely inside this network, men whose doors opened only to those carrying invisible shame. Hidden among the narrow back streets of Victorian towns were men who called themselves doctors only in the quietest moments. They did not hang signs outside their doors, nor did they publish their names in any directory. Their work existed in the same shadows where fear lived, serving those who needed help but could not risk being seen seeking it. These doctors survived on the illnesses society refused to acknowledge. Men who carried shame beneath their collars and sought treatment only when desperation overcame pride. Their rooms were nothing like official clinics. Most were tucked at the far end of twisting corridors, behind doors that looked as though they led to storage closets rather than medical spaces. A single oil lamp illuminated the room, casting stretched shadows across peeling walls. The cot in the corner was thin. The instruments laid out on a table were worn, and the lingering smell of disinfectant mixed sharply with damp wood. Men entering these rooms felt the weight of secrecy immediately. It pressed down on them more heavily than their own symptoms. The doctors themselves carried an unsettling stillness. They asked a few questions. Sometimes none at all. A man merely had to point at a rash or whisper a symptom, and treatment began without hesitation. Records were never written. Names were never repeated. The doctor's silence was not politeness. It was survival. Every patient represented risk, and any detail spoken too clearly could become a threat later. These men practiced medicine in the absence of trust, depending instead on routine and the unspoken agreement that both sides had much to lose. Some of these doctors had once held respectable positions. They had worked in hospitals until scandal, debt, or alcohol pushed them out. Others were self-taught, piecing together knowledge from military manuals or years of observing symptoms on battlefields. And then some had no formal training at all. Men who simply recognized a profitable need and stepped into it with a steady hand. Patients rarely knew which kind of doctor they were meeting. In truth, they did not care. What mattered most was that the doctor did not judge them. These practitioners charged well beyond ordinary medical fees. Men handed over coins without argument, knowing that they were paying not only for treatment, but also for invisibility. The more discreet the doctor, the higher the price. A gentleman who walked into one of these rooms understood immediately that silence cost more than skill. The doctor's calm expression, his refusal to ask about the source of infection, his quick, unceremonious application of ointments or tinctures, all of it signaled a transaction built entirely on the unspoken. Your secret stays here. For a price. Treatments were harsh. Solutions burned the skin. Powders left metallic tastes on the tongue. Syringes were used until their edges dulled. The doctor's voice, when he bothered to speak, was low and practical. He warned only about pain, not about risks or failures. Men endured these procedures because the alternative, public exposure, was far worse. They sat gripping the sides of chairs, muscles stiff, eyes fixed on the floor, trying to swallow both the pain and the humiliation. Outside these rooms, life continued with Victorian orderliness. Clerks filled ledger books. Carriages rolled across cobblestones, and gentlemen strolled with practiced composure. But inside, the facade broke. Men who spent their days projecting authority and confidence now waited quietly for instructions. Their bodies trembled slightly when the doctor examined them. Sweat gathered at the back of their necks. For a moment, they were stripped of their social armor, reduced to fear and flesh. The doctor, however, remained detached. He saw hundreds of men pass through these rooms, and their stories blended into one continuous rhythm: secrecy, regret, desperation. He treated every patient the same way, because every patient carried the same dread. Some tried to apologize for their condition. Others rambled nervously, trying to justify the choices that led them there. The doctor never responded to these confessions. His silence was a reminder that judgment had no place in this room. Only procedure. I find it unsettling to imagine how many lives these hidden doctors touched without ever truly knowing the men behind the symptoms. Their work kept society's moral facade intact, quietly absorbing the consequences of ignorance and shame. They existed at the edge of respectability, despised by official medicine, yet relied upon by those who needed them most. The hush that filled these dim back rooms revealed how far men would go to hide their suffering. Yet each whispered visit tied them more tightly to a world where healing depended on secrecy, not certainty. Some even claimed there were doctors whose true skill lay not in curing disease, but in erasing every trace a man ever sought their help. Among the hidden healers who operated in the back alleys of Victorian towns were men who wore no formal titles at all. They had never taken examinations, never attended lectures in polished lecture halls, and never earned the right to call themselves physicians in the eyes of the law. Yet their rooms stayed full, sometimes more crowded than those of licensed doctors. In a society where fear overshadowed science, these uncredentialed practitioners found their place with startling ease. Many had backgrounds that skirted the edges of medicine. Some had once worked as apothecaries' assistants, learning the properties of powders and tinctures through observation rather than instruction. Others were former military medics who had stitched wounds and treated infections under canvas tents, far from the oversight of hospitals. What they lacked in formal training, they compensated for with steady hands and a willingness to handle illnesses polite society refused to acknowledge. Their knowledge came from necessity, not textbooks. Clients sought them out because these men asked even fewer questions than the secretive doctors hidden behind brothels. They did not prod into personal histories or demand explanations. They understood that anyone who walked through their doors carried a burden heavier than the infection itself. Their practices thrived on a simple, unspoken promise: whatever happens here will stay here. For men terrified of exposure, that promise mattered more than proper credentials. The spaces these practitioners used were makeshift at best. A back room in a general shop, a corner divided off by a hanging cloth, a basement with low ceilings and the faint smell of mold. Tools were stored in wooden boxes or wrapped in cloth, cleaned only when time allowed. Yet men entered these cramped rooms with the same mixture of desperation and hope found in any medical waiting area. They were willing to accept less comfort, less sterility, and far less certainty if it meant avoiding the scrutiny of society. What made these unlicensed healers even more appealing was their demeanor. They carried an easy calm, shaped by years of dealing with the frightened and the ashamed. A man could confess symptoms in broken phrases, unsure of how to explain the details, and the healer would simply nod, already preparing a mixture. Their confidence, real or staged, was enough to steady the trembling hands of their patients. In rooms where fear thickened the air, reassurance was often more powerful than accuracy. They charged fees that seemed modest at first glance, but grew steep when desperation peaked. Hope, after all, had a price. So did silence. Men paid not just for medicine, but for the comfort of being treated by someone who would never utter their names again. In some cases, the healer's greatest skill lay not in curing illness, but in absorbing the panic of the men who came to them. A steady gaze, a firm voice, and a promise spoken softly could soothe a mind spiraling into dread. The treatments themselves varied wildly. Some mixtures were borrowed from old manuals or copied from remedies used on soldiers. Others were invented on the spot, based on intuition or rumor. A few were placebos, colored powders that did nothing except offer the illusion of control. One might expect outrage or complaint when these remedies failed. But men rarely returned to demand accountability. Shame kept them silent. In many cases, the belief that they had done something, anything, to address the illness was enough to keep panic at bay for a while. Victorian society's obsession with moral purity made deception thrive. These healers understood that a lie delivered with confidence could be more comforting than the harsh truth. If a man asked whether he would recover, the healer might answer firmly, even when certainty was impossible. Their rooms became theatres of controlled illusion, where belief often mattered more than medicine. Men left clutching small bottles or paper-wrapped powders as though they held salvation. I find it unsettling how easily trust shifted from trained physicians to men who relied on instinct and improvisation. But in a world where honesty risked exposure, a carefully spoken lie felt safer than a documented diagnosis. These healers survived not because they cured reliably, but because they offered what official medicine could not: anonymity wrapped in hope. The crowded rooms of these unlicensed healers revealed how desperately men sought comfort over certainty. Yet each visit deepened their dependence on a network held together by rumor and fragile trust. Some whispered of places where hope was mixed not with medicine, but with powders so dangerous they could kill as easily as they soothed. Across Victorian streets, in markets crowded with noise and restless footsteps, bottles and powders promising instant cures appeared everywhere. They glittered behind shop windows, lay arranged on wooden stalls, or hung from the belts of travelling vendors who shouted their promises with theatrical confidence. To a man carrying a secret illness, these so-called miracles felt like lifelines disguised as merchandise. The labels were bold, the guarantees absolute. Relief in 3 days, complete cleansing, restoration of strength. In a world where no one dared speak plainly about such diseases, the words printed on those bottles were the closest thing many men had to guidance. What made these cures so seductive was their certainty. They did not whisper or hesitate. Like the unlicensed healers tucked away in back rooms, they announced their power openly, as though no doubt had ever existed. For men drowning in fear, that certainty felt like a hand gripping theirs in the dark. All they had to do was pay. No questions, no records, no judgment, just a promise. Yet inside those bottles, behind the pretty colours and perfumed scents, were substances that gnawed at the body as mercilessly as the illnesses they claimed to treat. Mercury was a common ingredient, ground into ointments, dissolved into liquids, or mixed into powders that men swallowed without hesitation. It burned the mouth and left a metallic taste that lingered for hours. Some men believed the burning meant the cure was working. Others simply endured it, convinced pain was the price of healing. Opium found its way into many remedies as well. It dulled the agony and softened fear, wrapping the mind in a haze that felt like improvement. Men who took these mixtures often felt temporarily restored, clearer, steadier, and convinced the illness was retreating. But the relief was a trick of the body, nothing more than a borrowed calm that left them worse off each time it faded. The sellers knew this. They counted on the cycle of fear and relief, each dose drawing the man deeper into dependence. Other mixtures contained chemicals whose names most patients could not pronounce. Corrosive substances scraped at infected skin, leaving raw patches that sometimes looked cleaner simply because the damage had been scrubbed away. Pills shaped into neat white spheres hid compounds so toxic that prolonged use poisoned the blood. But the instructions told men to trust the process. And trust they did. Because a cure, even a brutal one, felt better than facing the truth of their illness. The advertisements for these remedies were crafted with careful manipulation. Newspapers printed sketches of doctors in crisp coats, testimonials from anonymous gentlemen, and dramatic before and after claims that blurred the line between hope and fraud. Many of these ads targeted men directly, using phrases that hinted at shame without naming it. They promised strength, vitality, and restoration of manhood, phrases designed to strike at insecurities that Victorian society fed relentlessly. In pharmacies, cures lined the shelves with polite respectability. Their glass bottles caught the light in a way that made them look almost elegant, as though decoration alone proved their worth. A man could buy them quickly, quietly, avoiding the risk of being recognized near the hidden clinics. These medicines felt safer simply because they existed in public view. Visibility became a disguise. If something could be purchased over the counter, it must be harmless. At least that was the logic men clung to. But the true reason these cures sold so easily was desperation. Men did not want explanations. They wanted absolution. They wanted to wake up a few days later with no symptoms, no guilt, no need to confront their choices. Asking questions would mean acknowledging danger, and acknowledging danger would mean facing consequences far beyond physical pain. So they swallowed powders that stung their throats, rubbed ointments that left their skin blistered, and drank liquids that made their hearts pound unevenly. Anything felt better than admitting they needed real help. Vendors understood this dynamic intimately. They watched their customers with calm, measuring their fear like merchants weighing grain. The more frightened the man, the more persuasive the remedy became. Some vendors even encouraged the panic, lowering their voices to imply that the ailment was serious. Too serious to wait. Too serious for hesitation. By the time the man handed over his coin, he was convinced not of the product's quality, but of the urgency pressing against his ribs. I find it unsettling how easily these false cures became a lifeline for men who had nowhere else to turn. Their suffering created an entire economy built not on healing but on exploiting silence. Every bottle sold represented another man, trying desperately to outrun shame with chemicals that promised hope while delivering harm. The fierce demand for these quick cures revealed how deeply fear shaped every decision men made about their bodies. Yet the more they trusted these dangerous remedies, the farther they drifted from the possibility of genuine help. Whispers began to circulate about healers who worked through letters alone, offering distant cures to men too frightened to speak face to face. Across the pages of Victorian newspapers, tucked between reports of railway expansion and announcements of public lectures, a different kind of message spread quietly. These were not articles but advertisements. Small rectangles of text bordered with decorative lines, promising to cure ailments no one dared speak of aloud. They targeted men specifically, using phrases crafted to strike at the deepest corners of shame: renewed vigor, restored manly strength, discreet remedy for private weakness. The wording was delicate enough to avoid scandal, yet unmistakable to anyone living with fear beneath his clothing. These ads appeared everywhere: morning papers, evening papers, penny weeklies, and even pamphlets handed out near train stations. Some featured illustrations of bearded doctors wearing stern expressions, their hands folded in authority. Others displayed glowing testimonials from anonymous gentlemen whose letters conveniently praised the miraculous effects of treatments purchased through the mail. To the average reader, the promises sounded rehearsed but tempting. In a society where real medical guidance came wrapped in judgment, these printed words felt strangely welcoming. Most of these advertisements led nowhere trustworthy. The addresses printed at the bottom often pointed to rented rooms, shell companies, or mail drops staffed by clerks who knew nothing of medicine. The remedies sold were the same mixtures of mercury, opium, or coloured powders that had already harmed countless men. Some bottles were filled with harmless sugar water, others with toxic liquids sharp enough to scar the throat. But the truth behind the products mattered less than the illusion of rescue. The men who purchased these remedies rarely asked questions. They clipped the ads discreetly, folded the paper into their coat pockets, and sent letters using pseudonyms or initials. Coins were wrapped in cloth to mute the rattle inside the envelope. When packages arrived, they were handled like contraband, opened behind locked doors, hidden beneath floorboards, or consumed quickly before anyone could notice. Men treated the advertisements as private agreements. You promised to fix me, and I promised to remain silent. The sellers understood this dynamic perfectly. They relied on the fact that no man suffering from a private disease would risk exposing himself by lodging a complaint. Deception thrived because victims stayed invisible, even when a remedy caused violent illness. The blame fell on the disease rather than the product. Fear became a shield for those exploiting it. Every month, new advertisements replaced old ones. Shifting addresses, brand names, and medical claims, while trafficking in the same lies. What made these ads particularly effective was how they blended into the fabric of everyday life. A gentleman reading the paper over breakfast might glance at one without meaning to. A worker returning home on a crowded train might see an ad tucked beside a column about factory wages. The more familiar the ads became, the more legitimate they appeared. Repetition gave them a kind of authority, not because they were true, but because they refused to disappear. Some advertisements even mimicked scientific language, using terms borrowed from medical journals. They spoke of nervous exhaustion, vital depletion, or internal imbalance. Phrases carefully chosen to sound clinical while remaining vague enough to cover any number of symptoms. Men recognized themselves in these descriptions, often more clearly than in real medical texts. The ambiguity allowed them to imagine their illness as something common, treatable, easily hidden. There was a chilling brilliance in how these ads manipulated loneliness. Many men suffering from private diseases felt isolated. They could not confide in friends, could not tell their wives, and could not approach hospitals without risking exposure. The advertisements whispered to that isolation, offering solutions wrapped in anonymity. They promised understanding without judgment, cure without confession. For men who felt trapped, the words felt like the closest thing to compassion they would ever receive. The profits generated were staggering. Sellers rented entire floors of buildings just to sort letters and pack bottles. Some operated like factories, producing remedies by the hundreds while maintaining the illusion of individual care. Each envelope sent out carried with it not only ingredients but also a quiet agreement, no questions asked, no answers given. The business flourished because it catered not to health but to fear. I find it unsettling how these printed deceptions thrived in a society that prided itself on progress and refinement. Newspapers that claimed to uphold moral standards willingly filled their pages with lies because the revenue outweighed the shame. Men searching for help had to navigate a world where every offer of assistance might be a trap, and every promise might mask a greater danger. The rise of these advertisements revealed how desperation could turn printed words into instruments of false hope. Yet the more men relied on anonymous promises, the more vulnerable they became to those who understood the value of distance. Rumors soon spread of healers who treated illness without ever seeing their patients, relying only on letters that carried secrets across the city. Long before official institutions attempted to regulate medical practice, a new kind of healer emerged quietly within Victorian society. One who never met his patients, never examined a single wound, and never risked being recognized in the street. His entire world existed on paper. For men terrified of exposure, this distance felt safer than any locked door or hidden clinic. A letter became both confession and shield, carrying fear across town without requiring the sender to face another human being. The process was strangely simple. A man wrote down his symptoms in vague but desperate language, careful not to reveal his name, occupation, or address too clearly. The letter often trembled with uncertainty, as though shame itself had seeped into the ink. It was slipped into an envelope with coins or a postal order, then dropped quietly into a box where no eyes could witness his hesitation. Days later, a small package would arrive: powders, tinctures, or pills wrapped in plain paper, accompanied by instructions printed in the same detached tone found in the advertisements that inspired the exchange. No examination, no questions, no warnings, only trust built on anonymity. These letter doctors operated from rented rooms, using piles of correspondence to diagnose illnesses they had never seen. Some worked alone, reading each letter carefully before selecting a remedy from shelves lined with unlabeled bottles. Others employed assistants who sorted the mail according to keywords, allowing the doctor to answer dozens of cases in a single afternoon. Efficiency mattered more than accuracy. For every man seeking help, 10 others were writing the same fearful phrases, describing symptoms that blended into a chorus of anxiety. What made this system so powerful was its invisibility. A patient could receive treatment without ever speaking his secret aloud. Packages arrived, wrapped tightly, the handwriting discreet, the return address cryptic. To anyone observing, the parcel could contain ink, tobacco, or a book. No one needed to know that inside were remedies meant to hide the consequences of choices made in silence. In a society obsessed with propriety, anonymity was not just convenience, it was salvation. But with anonymity came risk. Many of these so-called doctors had no training beyond what they gleaned from cheap manuals or stolen recipes. Their remedies were often the same toxic mixtures sold in markets: mercury disguised as healing, opium disguised as relief, chemical burns disguised as progress. Yet men continued to trust the process because distance felt safer than competence. A real doctor might look them in the eye. A letter never would. The system also removed accountability. If a remedy failed, there was no office to return to, no practitioner to confront, no guarantee of truth. Correspondence could simply stop. The doctor could vanish overnight, replaced by another advertisement in another newspaper, promising the same miracles under a different name. Patients rarely noticed the shift. They were too focused on concealment to question the reliability of those profiting from their fear. For many men, writing the letter was the hardest part. It meant admitting the presence of an illness they had tried to ignore. Some rewrote their descriptions repeatedly, searching for words that sounded less incriminating. Others softened the truth, hoping their condition would appear less dire if expressed politely. The distance between patient and doctor allowed for dishonesty, yet it also deepened the sense of isolation. Men asked for help without ever receiving reassurance. A strange kind of healing stripped of human presence. The postal system itself became an accomplice to secrecy. Carriers delivered packages without knowing what they contained, touching countless envelopes filled with confessions they would never read. In this way, the machinery of the empire unknowingly sustained a hidden medical world, moving remedies between strangers who relied on the illusion that anonymity could erase consequences. I find it unsettling that in a society overflowing with rules, restrictions, and moral expectations, the most effective medical system for many men was one built entirely on distance. The absence of connection became its greatest strength. No judgment, no witnesses, only ink, paper, and the hope that a stranger somewhere understood enough to help. The quiet spread of these letter doctors revealed how deeply men craved treatment that required no confession. Yet each envelope sent into the postal system pulled them further into a world where help and harm shared the same handwriting. Whispers eventually hinted at darker forces shaping this silence. Voices that framed illness not as misfortune, but as punishment. In Victorian towns, illness was rarely viewed as a simple failure of the body. When the sickness touched the realm of sexuality, it became something darker, an accusation, a mark of moral collapse. Churches preached about purity, with voices that thundered through stone halls, leaving no room for nuance. Any disease linked to desire was framed as a consequence of sin, a punishment embedded in flesh. Men who carried these infections felt the weight not only of pain, but of judgment heavy enough to bend their posture as they walked. This belief seeped into daily life as naturally as fog drifting through narrow streets. Conversations in markets and parlours carried an unspoken consensus. A man suffering from such an illness had brought it upon himself. He had strayed from the rigid expectations of respectability, allowed impulse to outweigh discipline, and now bore the cost. His neighbours might speak kindly to him, but beneath their politeness lay a quiet withdrawal. Trust eroded. Invitations faded. The disease, though unseen, made him an outsider. Hospitals, which should have offered relief, felt like courts disguised as medical institutions. Men feared the questions that would be asked, the records that would be kept, the expressions, however controlled, that would flicker across the faces of physicians. A hospital visit meant documentation, and documentation meant evidence. Evidence could travel on paper, en tongue, on rumours. A single clerk could read a file, and before long, a reputation could crumble, so men stayed away. Even when their symptoms worsened, the thought of entering a public ward was more frightening than the illness gnawing at their bodies. Church teachings only tightened this fear. Sermons warned that immoral acts left stains not only on the soul but on the body itself. Preachers described punishment hidden beneath clothing, festering where no one could see, waiting to reveal the truth of a man's desires. Congregations listened in rigid silence, absorbing the message. Illness in this context was not a medical failure, but a divine verdict. For men sitting in the pews with symptoms already blooming under their skin, these words struck with terrifying precision. Their sickness became a secret more dangerous than any physical pain. At home, the pressure intensified. Wives suspected, but did not ask. Servants noticed subtle changes. The longer nights spent pacing, the sudden reluctance to bathe, the bottles hidden at the back of drawers. Yet everyone maintained the fiction that dignity remained intact. To confront the illness openly would require confronting the circumstances that caused it, and Victorian households preferred denial to truth. Domestic silence became another layer of punishment. In workplaces, men tried to hide the tremors in their hands or the weakness in their limbs. Employers rarely needed proof to withdraw trust. Mere suspicion was enough. Entire careers could collapse under the weight of moral judgment. Men who had once moved confidently through their professions now avoided colleagues' eyes, fearful that any sign of discomfort might expose them. Social life became a delicate performance, one misstep away from ruin. This environment, heavy with condemnation, suffocated by expectations, drove men deeper into secrecy. Every public institution felt hostile. Every familiar street seemed lined with eyes ready to measure their worth. The harsher society judged them, the more desperately they sought spaces where judgment could not reach. That desperation fed the network of hidden healers, mail-order doctors, brothel-guided treatments, and backroom remedies. Each layer of silence society imposed gave strength to the underground systems forming beneath it. Ironically, the stricter the moral rules became, the more these secret networks thrived. As shame intensified, so did the demand for invisible cures. A man who felt condemned by the church and neighbours had no choice but to seek help where his name would never be spoken. The network offered what society refused, a chance to be treated without being defined by his illness. Every whispered transaction, every hidden visit, every quietly exchanged coin strengthened this shadow world. The cruelty lay not only in the stigma, but in the isolation it created. Men suffered without guidance, without comfort, without the reassurance of being treated as human rather than sinful. They navigated their illness alone, avoiding institutions that should have offered support. The system punished them twice, first with disease, then with silence. And in that silence, desperation grew fertile. I find it unsettling how moral judgment became a barrier to healing, turning men into fugitives within their own towns. Instead of seeking help, they sought shadows. Instead of speaking, they hid behind excuses and polite smiles. Society's condemnation shaped their choices more sharply than any medical advice could. The belief that illness was a moral sentence left men trapped between fear and silence, turning their suffering into a private burden no one dared to acknowledge. Yet, every attempt to hide their condition only pushed them deeper into the shadows, where unofficial healers prospered without question. Rumors later emerged about certain deaths quietly rewritten on paper, hinting at truths families refused to face once the body had grown still. Death, in Victorian society, often served as the final veil, one that families pulled over the truth with quiet, deliberate hands. When a man succumbed to the late stages of a sexually transmitted disease, the transformation in his body was unmistakable: hollow cheeks, trembling limbs, rashes blooming like bruised petals, and a mind slipping into confusion. Yet, when the time came to record his passing, the truth was softened, reshaped, erased. The certificate would read fever, consumption, or exhaustion, as if the body had simply grown tired rather than been destroyed from within. Each word functioned as a shield, protecting reputations that mattered far more to the living than honesty about the dead. In homes where curtains were drawn tight, the family gathered around the fading man with a tense mixture of fear and pride. They mourned the suffering but clung fiercely to the belief that dignity must outlive breath itself. To admit the real illness would mean admitting where it came from, the streets he walked, the choices he made, the secret visits whispered about behind closed doors. Victorian society judged harshly, and reputations could shatter like glass at the slightest hint of moral weakness. Families understood this too well. Silence became the preferred inheritance. Undertakers, accustomed to the signs of certain diseases, rarely questioned the family's requests. They prepared bodies ravaged by lesions and swelling without comment, smoothing fabric over damaged skin, adjusting collars to hide marks that would raise unwanted questions. Their hands performed the final act of concealment, preserving the illusion of a peaceful death. In this last act, the body became a fragile lie, dressed in black cloth. Doctors, too, often complied. Confronting the truth served no one. Neither the family, desperate to avoid disgrace, nor the medical authorities who lacked the means to challenge widespread moral conventions. So the diagnosis written on paper was chosen with care, made to sound natural, plausible, unprovocative. A single stroke of ink turned syphilis into tuberculosis, shame into tragedy, secrecy into decorum. The disease that consumed countless lives slipped quietly beneath official records, leaving history with a distorted image of Victorian health. Within these households, grief unfolded behind closed doors. Mothers wept without understanding the cause. Wives sat stiffly, staring at clasped hands, swallowing a fear that their own bodies might hold the same secret infection. Some children were kept away from the funeral, told only that their father had been ill for some time, as though those vague words were enough to build a memory. The truth travelled between adults in whispers, short, trembling phrases exchanged in kitchens and corridors, where candles flickered like nervous pulses. What made this concealment so powerful was the shared belief that dishonour was a fate worse than suffering. A man could waste away slowly, lose strength, lose clarity, but as long as his name remained untainted in the eyes of neighbours, he was considered fortunate. Appearance mattered more than accuracy. Even in death, he was expected to uphold the family's dignity. The disease became a ghost trapped within the coffin, unspoken but present, haunting those who witnessed its devastation. I find it unsettling how eagerly society chooses to manipulate the truth, preferring a clean narrative over an honest one. It was easier to mourn an invented illness than confront the messy reality of human desire and fear. By rewriting the cause of death, families believed they were protecting their loved one, when in fact they were erasing the pain he endured. In doing so, they also erased the possibility of understanding the true scope of the epidemic, quietly consuming their streets. This pattern of silent deaths strengthened the underground medical networks that operated in the shadows. For every man who died unnamed and misdiagnosed, others became even more determined to avoid public exposure. Their fear deepened, their secrecy tightened, and the hidden healers grew more indispensable. Death certificates, meant to document the truth, instead became tools that reinforced the very system driving men into back rooms and clandestine cures. The late-stage symptoms of the disease were unmistakable, yet society's desire to protect its own reputation smothered any chance of openly acknowledging the epidemic. It was not the illness that defined the narrative, but the shame attached to it. Victorian morality demanded that pain be transformed into something respectable, even if it meant distorting reality until it no longer resembled the world people actually lived in. The quiet rewriting of these deaths exposed how deeply Victorian families depended on illusion to preserve their social standing. Yet each disguised ending only pushed the truth further underground, strengthening the world where secrets thrived more easily than honesty. Stories soon emerged of women blamed for these tragedies, as though shifting guilt onto them might restore the order everyone depended on. In Victorian streets, blame often travelled along the easiest path, settling on the shoulders least able to resist. When men fell ill with diseases they dared not name, society rarely questioned their choices. Instead, it turned toward women, particularly those working in brothels, and declared them the source of corruption. The phrase "fallen woman" carried more weight than any diagnosis, shaping public opinion with a cruelty that felt almost effortless. To many, it was simpler to believe that these women poisoned honourable men than to confront the truth of desire, secrecy, and responsibility shared. Authorities reinforced this belief through their actions. Police raided brothels not to protect the women inside, but to find someone to blame. Women were seized, questioned, examined, and sometimes imprisoned under the guise of public health, even though the very laws targeting them ignored the men who visited the same establishments nightly. Doctors working for the state conducted invasive inspections, claiming to safeguard society, but in reality, preserving a hierarchy where male dignity remained untouchable. The imbalance was stark. Women were scrutinized, while men were shielded. Inside hospitals, where these examinations took place, fear spread like a quiet stain. Women stood in cold rooms, waiting for their names to be called, knowing that a single mark on a doctor's chart could change their lives. Some were declared infected, based on a limited understanding of the disease. Others simply because they had been arrested in a place authorities wished to control. Treatment was harsh, often experimental, and rarely conducted with compassion. The goal was containment, not care. In these rooms, the moral judgments of society took physical form. Meanwhile, men who carried the same illnesses walked freely through public spaces, their reputations intact. They dined in restaurants, attended church services, and strolled through markets without fear of exposure. Even when symptoms became visible, rash, tremors, and bouts of fever, excuses were easily accepted. A chill from the weather, exhaustion from work, or a simple touch of illness reassured acquaintances eager to avoid uncomfortable truths. Society allowed men to remain untouched by suspicion because acknowledging their role would mean dismantling cherished illusions. At home, wives bore the consequences quietly, Some fell ill after their husbands returned from brothel visits. Yet blame rarely travelled toward the men. Instead, families speculated about the wife's past, hygiene, or her supposed weaknesses. The disease passed from man to woman, but shame flowed in the opposite direction. Domestic life absorbed this injustice silently. Building layers of resentment and fear beneath the polished surface, Victorian households tried to maintain. I find it unsettling how readily blame moved toward women, as though their existence alone explained the spread of disease. The narrative was too convenient, too aligned with societal structures that valued male purity while dismissing female suffering. Women became symbols rather than individuals. Symbols of temptation, contamination, and moral weakness. Even those who worked in brothels did so not out of malice, but often out of necessity. Poverty, limited employment, and social abandonment shaped their choices more than desire ever did. Yet society refused to acknowledge this, preferring a story where vice had a single, feminine face. Newspapers fueled the public's imagination with articles warning of dangerous women roaming the streets. These pieces rarely mentioned the men who kept the brothels in business, nor the authorities who tolerated them. Sensational headlines made it easier to fear women than to question the structures enabling exploitation. Readers absorbed these stories without hesitation, reassured by narratives that separated them from the problem. Fear of disease became intertwined with fear of women, particularly those on the margins. This distortion of responsibility strengthened the hidden medical networks flourishing in the shadows. Men sought secret treatment because society protected their anonymity, while women had no such refuge. Their bodies were policed publicly, their illnesses catalogued, their fates decided by officials who rarely considered their humanity. Each arrest, each forced examination, reinforced a system where women carried the weight of male desire and male fear combined. Looking at these patterns, it becomes clear how Victorian society used women as shields against its own discomfort. By blaming them, the public avoided examining its moral contradictions, the coexistence of strict ideals with widespread clandestine behaviour, the divide between outward respectability and inner weakness. Women bore the accusation so men could remain untouched. The relentless scrutiny forced upon these women exposed how deeply society depended on them as scapegoats for its own failings. Yet every accusation only strengthened the underground world, where men sought help away from public judgment. Quiet stories began spreading about military camps handling the worst cases, hidden far from the accusations that consumed civilian streets. In the military, illness was never simply a medical matter. It was a threat to discipline, a crack in the image of strength that every soldier was expected to embody. When venereal disease appeared among the ranks, it moved quietly, travelling from camp to camp like a rumour carried by tired bodies. Soldiers who showed the first symptoms, rash, fever, and aching joints, were not sent to ordinary hospitals. Instead, they were removed from sight, escorted to secluded wards on the edges of the barracks or to improvised infirmaries deep within training grounds. These rooms were stripped of identity, marked only by their distance from parade grounds and officers' corridors. Their purpose was silence. The men brought there understood immediately what their presence implied. They were not being treated as patients but as liabilities. A soldier's reputation depended entirely on his ability to appear unbreakable. Illness touched by sexuality carried a deeper shame, one that threatened not only the individual but the imagined purity of the regiment itself. Superiors preferred to believe such afflictions came from weak morals rather than the harsh loneliness of military life. For the infected, the message was unmistakable: endure quietly, heal quickly, and leave no trace of disgrace. Inside these hidden wards, military doctors worked with an urgency shaped more by fear of scandal than concern for the men themselves. Some were properly trained, men who had studied medicine in universities before donning uniforms. Others had learned through experience alone. passing methods down like smuggled secrets during long shifts. Their goal was not full recovery, but rapid improvement. Something that would allow the soldier to return to formation before questions reached higher ranks. Quick treatment became the unofficial motto, a phrase that promised relief while concealing the risk behind it. These treatments were often brutal. Solutions soaked in mercury were rubbed into inflamed skin. Needles delivered mixtures whose ingredients were barely understood. Soldiers swallowed powders that burned internally, believing pain signaled healing. The methods were harsh, but the alternative, public exposure, felt unbearable. When the commanding officers visited the ward, their glances were brief, controlled, and uninterested in details. They wanted numbers, timelines, certainty. Individual suffering did not appear in their reports. I find it unsettling how these men endured their illness surrounded by the rigid machinery of the military, which demanded absolute order even in moments of vulnerability. Instead of comfort, they received commands. Instead of reassurance, they received warnings about discipline and conduct. Even as their bodies trembled from fever, they were expected to maintain composure. That pressure drained them more than the illness itself. Their silence was not a choice but a requirement. Within the ward, camaraderie existed in quiet form. Soldiers avoided direct questions but exchanged small gestures, passing water, lifting blankets, and offering space near the window where the air was cooler. They recognized the fear in each other's faces, the dread of being deemed unfit or morally compromised. Yet even these shared moments felt fragile, as though friendship itself might reveal too much. Every man carried his secret alone, even while lying only inches from another who suffered the same fate. Military doctors understood the stakes. They worked behind closed doors, rarely documenting the true cause of illness. Notes were sparse, phrased carefully to avoid linking the disease to misconduct. A soldier might be recorded as suffering from fatigue, inflammation, or general weakness. These softened terms protected the institution, allowing the regiment to maintain an image of discipline untouched by human imperfection. Truth became secondary to reputation. At times, men who failed to improve quickly were transferred to even more secluded facilities. Tents pitched far from camp, rooms in abandoned buildings, or makeshift infirmaries concealed behind supply depots. These locations offered privacy, but they also removed the soldier from the life he knew. Days passed in a haze of pain, interrupted only by the sound of boots on wooden floors or the distant echo of drills continuing without him. Recovery felt less like healing and more like exile. Some soldiers never returned. Their families received letters describing severe infection or sudden illness, accompanied by reassurances that their loved one had served honorably. The true cause of death remained hidden behind formal language. The military viewed scandal as a greater danger than disease, and so the truth was buried alongside the bodies. This secrecy strengthened the underground networks already flourishing outside the barracks. Soldiers who feared the brutal treatments or dreaded being isolated sought unofficial remedies from civilian contacts. Former soldiers, sympathetic nurses, and brothel workers who had seen similar cases countless times. These hidden exchanges created a parallel system of care shaped by desperation rather than trust. Every soldier navigating this world walked a line between survival and ruin. The military's approach reflected a broader Victorian belief. Maintaining an appearance of purity mattered more than confronting the complexities of human behavior. In the barracks, illness became a symbol of failure rather than a medical condition. Men bore this weight alone, stumbling through procedures designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. The secrecy that filled these military wards revealed how fiercely institutions guarded their image, even at the cost of the men who served them. Yet the more the army hid, the more soldiers slipped quietly into the shadows, seeking help in places untouched by official rules. Stories eventually emerged about prisons functioning as silent refuges for the sick, where treatment occurred with even fewer questions asked. Prisons in Victorian society were already places where people vanished from public memory. But for those who carried venereal diseases, the disappearance was even more complete. Ill inmates rarely remained among the general population. Once symptoms emerged, lesions, fever, trembling, or the unmistakable decline of the late stages, the prisoner was quietly removed. Guards avoided explanations. Other inmates watched the empty bed in the cell block, learned not to ask questions, and forced themselves to ignore the implications. Some men reappeared weeks later, weaker and hollow-eyed. Others never returned at all. These removals were not part of any official policy, but they unfolded with the consistency of ritual. A guard would approach the sick inmate late at night or early before dawn, when the corridors were cold and nearly silent. The prisoner was escorted away, often with chains that clinked softly as though marking the rhythm of secrecy. The destination was rarely disclosed. Sometimes a storage room that had been converted into a crude infirmary. Sometimes a basement where the air smelled of damp stone. In certain prisons, there were entire wings that ordinary inmates never saw, built for the express purpose of hiding what authorities did not want, acknowledged. Within these hidden rooms, treatment was minimal and often experimental. Supplies were limited, and proper medicines were rare. Some prisons employed unofficial healers, wardens with crude medical knowledge, former army medics, or inmates who had once worked in brothels and recognized the symptoms better than any doctor. Their skill varied wildly. Some offered relief. Others inflicted pain that left the sick shaking on their thin mattresses. Whatever happened behind those closed doors stayed there, buried under the weight of stone and silence. The isolation was not only physical. Prisoners who were taken to these rooms understood instantly that they had become something more dangerous than criminals. They were now carriers of a shame the institution refused to confront openly. In a world where disease was tied to morality, their condition was seen as proof of past sins and weakness. Rather than receiving sympathy, they encountered avoidance. Guards handled them with gloved caution. Inmates looked away, and no one spoke more than necessary. Illness stripped them of whatever humanity prison life had left. I find it unsettling how quickly a man could become invisible behind those walls. One day, he shared rations and exhausted conversations with other inmates. The next, he existed only as a rumor. Some prisoners whispered theories about what happened in the hidden infirmaries. Procedures gone wrong. Bodies buried outside the main grounds. Transfers to unknown locations. None of these rumors was confirmed, but the lack of answers made them more believable. In a place where suffering was common, the prospect of vanishing without explanation felt disturbingly plausible. The few who returned rarely spoke about their time in isolation. Their silence came not from defiance, but from fear. They had endured treatments that blurred the line between healing and punishment. Disinfectants burned their skin. Instruments clattered in dim rooms. And instructions were delivered with an urgency that suggested the goal was containment rather than care. These men moved differently afterward. Slower, more cautious, as if carrying secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Prison officials preferred this silence. They filed minimal paperwork, avoided recording the true nature of the illness, and justified their secrecy by claiming it prevented panic among inmates. In reality, the secrecy protected the institution, shielding it from accusations of neglect or improper medical conduct. Disease behind prison walls became an administrative inconvenience, handled quietly, so the public never questioned how deeply it spread. Prisons also harbored their own clandestine markets for remedies. Inmates traded contraband pills, powders of unknown origin, and scraps of advice learned from brothel districts outside. These makeshift cures circulated through cells, offering hope but often causing more harm. Men swallowed substances that burned their throats or left them bedridden for days. Still, they continued to seek them, because the alternative, being taken to the hidden infirmary, seemed far worse. This private world of sickness and silence strengthened the broader underground medical network forming beyond the prison gates. Former prisoners, once released, carried the memory of these secret treatments into civilian life. Many avoided official doctors altogether, choosing instead to seek help from the same hidden practitioners who served brothel districts and military camps. The prison system, meant to correct behavior, inadvertently spread distrust of legitimate medicine and deepened reliance on shadowy alternatives. The cruelty lay not only in the physical suffering, but in the erasure of identity. A man already punished by the law now found himself punished again by the quiet disappearance of his dignity. Disease became a second sentence, harsher than the first, because it left no room for appeal. Within the thick walls of the prison, he was not a prisoner with a name, only a problem to be contained. The silence that swallowed sick inmates revealed how thoroughly prisons depended on disappearance to maintain their fragile order. Yet each hidden removal only strengthened the underground paths men followed once they returned to the world outside. Soon, attention shifted toward public hospitals, where fear of exposure shaped choices just as powerfully as the illness itself. Public hospitals in Victorian cities stood like solemn monuments, tall, grey, and imposing. To the ordinary citizen, they represented order and authority. But for men suffering from venereal diseases, these institutions felt less like places of healing and more like silent chambers of judgment. Their doors were open to the sick, yet somehow closed to the shamed. Anyone seeking treatment for an illness tied to a high risked losing more than his health. He risked his identity. The fear began the moment a man imagined stepping onto the hospital grounds. Public hospitals kept detailed records, and clerks documented every symptom, every admission, every whispered explanation. Once written, those details could not be retrieved. A single entry in a ledger might drift through administrative hands, and soon the patient's private burden became a topic of hallway conversation or, worse, a mark forever attached to his name. Men looked at those stone buildings and saw not safety, but exposure. Inside, the wards were starkly divided. Patients with illnesses considered respectable, broken limbs, fevers, and industrial injuries filled the main rooms. But those suspected of carrying sexually transmitted diseases were often separated, not for protection, but to prevent them from disrupting the institution's moral reputation. Doctors sometimes refused to see them altogether, insisting that such afflictions reflected poor character rather than unfortunate circumstance. This refusal was rarely written on paper, yet it shaped countless decisions behind closed doors. Even when treated, these men endured a level of scrutiny reserved for the morally condemned. Nurses exchanged glances. Other patients shifted away in their beds. The atmosphere made recovery feel impossible. Shame worked its way into the bloodstream, heavier than any fever. The hospital gown, thin and cold, seemed to expose more than just the body. It exposed every secret that had driven the man there. I find it unsettling how public institutions meant to serve the vulnerable became barriers instead. A man with trembling hands and burning skin would stand at the hospital entrance, staring at its windows glowing faintly in the dusk, and turn away before crossing the threshold. That small act of retreat was repeated countless times. The illness he carried was invisible compared to the condemnation he feared would follow him out of the building. The architecture of these hospitals contributed to the fear. Long corridors echoed with footsteps, amplifying the feeling of being watched. Waiting rooms were arranged so that everyone faced one another. Even the intake desks were positioned near open hallways where clerks and attendants could overhear conversations. Privacy was nearly impossible. A single question asked too loudly, "How long have you had these symptoms?" could unravel a man's reputation. To be seen in the wrong ward, to speak with the wrong doctor. to hesitate in front of the wrong door. Each moment carried risk. This dread pushed countless men toward alternative paths. Instead of admitting themselves into public care, they sought treatment in places hidden from scrutiny. Brothel corridors where madams gave quiet instructions, apothecaries willing to sell mixtures without questions, or back rooms run by men who claimed medical skill but held no license. These routes were dangerous. Yet they offered the one thing public hospitals could not: anonymity. For many, the hospital became a symbol of everything they hoped to avoid: exposure, record-keeping, and the cold gaze of society. They preferred to suffer privately rather than endure the institutional glare. Some delayed treatment until their bodies weakened, dragging themselves through streets at dusk in search of quick cures sold in alley stalls. Others wrote desperate letters to mail-order doctors, hoping the distance would protect them. The public hospital stood untouched in the center of the city, yet its intended patients circled it like frightened shadows. Doctors working in these hospitals were aware of the absences. They knew men were suffering in silence. New cases were being treated elsewhere, with unpredictable results. And new rumors pointed to underground networks flourishing under their noses. Yet their silence preserved the institution's image. Acknowledging the epidemic openly would require changing the moral framework that shaped medical care. It was easier to ignore the problem than confront the structure supporting it. The result was a painful irony. The place best equipped to treat the disease became the place least trusted by those who needed help. Men walked past the hospital day after day, clutching their coats tighter, pretending the symptoms meant nothing. Inside, beds stood empty in wards that could have offered relief. But fear prevailed. Reputation weighed more heavily than survival. The sight of these hospitals turning away the very men who needed them revealed how deeply judgment shaped Victorian medicine. Yet each decision to avoid their doors pushed more patients into the underworld of secret healers and silent cures. In those shadows, whispered codes and unwritten rules began forming a parallel system as organized as the institutions it sought to escape. Beneath the surface of Victorian respectability, a hidden medical world operated with a precision that seemed almost contradictory to its secrecy. This underground system, woven between brothel keepers, discreet doctors, and desperate clients, followed rules as structured as those of any formal institution. There were no written codes, no official meetings, no public acknowledgements. Yet everyone involved understood the boundaries. Survival depended on honoring them. In a society where reputation governed every decision, this shadow network became a refuge for those who needed treatment without exposure. Madams played a central role in maintaining order. Far from being mere proprietors of illicit establishments, they functioned as gatekeepers of information, deciding who could be trusted and who posed a risk to the fragile balance. They kept mental ledgers of doctors who were discreet, healers whose methods were effective, and men whose presence might disrupt the chain of secrecy. When a client showed the first signs of illness, discomfort, trembling, or whispered fears, the madam's guidance determined whether he entered the hidden world or remained in dangerous denial. Her word carried weight because it was grounded not in authority, but in necessity. Doctors who worked within this system understood their responsibilities with equal clarity. They asked a few questions, accepted payment quietly, and recorded nothing. Their practices existed in back rooms illuminated by single lamps, accessible only through narrow corridors or unmarked doors. Some operated behind brothels, others behind apothecaries or bathhouses. Their medical tools were simple, their remedies often harsh, but they offered the one thing the public medical system could not: anonymity. Respectability did not matter in these rooms. Discretion did. Clients who sought help learned to follow the unwritten rules quickly. They arrived alone, usually after dusk, avoiding eye contact with anyone they might recognize. They kept transactions brief, spoke softly, and never mentioned names. Men who violated these expectations, those who boasted, questioned too much, or spoke too loudly, found themselves quietly removed from the network. A madam might refuse them entry. A doctor might claim to be unavailable. Doors that once opened for them would remain closed. This was the only enforcement the system needed. I find it unsettling how smoothly these hidden arrangements operated, as though secrecy itself required its own form of discipline. The people involved had no official authority, yet the structure they created was more stable than many public institutions. Everyone understood the cost of disorder. If a secret was revealed, if a name reached the wrong ears, the entire system could collapse. Fear created cooperation, and cooperation created a strange, silent order. Transactions moved with the rhythm of necessity. A client would knock at the back door of a brothel, be admitted without acknowledgement, and follow a familiar path down a dim hallway. A doctor would greet him with a curt nod, perform a brief examination, and offer a remedy with minimal explanation. Payment exchanged hands in folded envelopes. Then the client would leave the way he came, disappearing into the night before guilt or doubt could catch up. These interactions repeated daily across the city, forming a web of connections held together by shared vulnerability. The consequences for breaking the rules were immediate. A man who attempted to negotiate price, threaten exposure, or involve outsiders found himself cast out entirely. Word travelled quickly through discreet channels. Madams warned one another. Doctors kept their distance. And the network closed around itself like a wound protecting against infection. No violence was needed. Social exile within the shadow system was punishment enough. Without access to its resources, a man risked being forced back into public hospitals or left untreated altogether. The fear of such outcomes kept most participants obedient. This hidden order functioned not only through fear, but through a surprising degree of trust. Madams trusted doctors to protect their establishments. Doctors trusted clients to keep silent. Clients trusted both to preserve their anonymity. In a world built on secrets, trust became the currency that allowed everything to function. It was fragile, but it held because everyone had something to lose. The duality of Victorian society made this underground system feel almost inevitable. Above ground, morality dictated behavior. Below ground, necessity dictated survival. Public life demanded purity. Private life demanded discretion. These conflicting expectations created a space where a parallel medical world could thrive, operating with quiet efficiency while remaining invisible to those who preferred not to see it. The silent rules binding this hidden network revealed how easily structure formed in the shadows when society refused to acknowledge certain truths. Yet the deeper these arrangements took root, the more men learned to seek healers whose reputations existed entirely outside official medicine. Rumors quietly grew about doctors whose mastery of secrecy elevated them to a status few dared question. Among Victorian men, the most respected doctors were not those with gilded plaques on their doors or formal degrees displayed in polished frames. The ones spoken of in quiet admiration were those who understood the value of silence. These physicians moved through the city with unremarkable faces and modest clothing, yet their names travelled far beyond their small rooms. They became legends not because of advanced knowledge, but because they guarded the secrets of men whose reputations could not survive a single careless word. Their clinics rarely appeared on any official map. A man might find one hidden behind the counter of a small apothecary, accessible only through a narrow doorway masked by shelves of jars and powders. Another might be tucked inside a bathhouse, where steam muffled conversations and footsteps. Some existed in the most unexpected places, behind a laundress's shop, beneath a tea house, or even in a small chamber attached to a church building where the doctor worked by lamplight while hymns drifted faintly through the walls. Each location was chosen for its ability to disappear into the city's noise. The journey to these places was almost ceremonial. A man did not simply walk in, he approached cautiously, observing the street before entering. Inside, he waited until the room emptied, then exchanged subtle gestures with the attendant. A nod, a glance, a folded note containing no name. Trust began with the understanding that nothing spoken inside those walls would travel beyond them. For many men, this was the first moment of ease they had felt since their symptoms appeared. The doctors who earned legendary status understood that silence was their strongest medicine. They asked only the essential questions, never prying into personal details or histories. Their examinations were efficient, their treatments direct. Remedies were prepared with measured care, stored in unmarked containers, and handed over with instructions spoken softly enough to fade before reaching the door. Men left these rooms feeling both relieved and unsettled. Relieved by the treatment, unsettled by how deeply the doctor seemed to understand the weight they carried. I find it unsettling how quickly these doctors learn to navigate the unspoken fears of their patients. They sensed hesitation in posture, guilt in silence, desperation in trembling hands. Their reputations grew not because they performed miracles, but because they respected the fragile dignity of men living in a society that demanded perfection. In a world where a single rumor could destroy a life, these physicians offered the closest thing to safety. Their ability to keep secrets was so valued that men traveled across districts to seek them out. Some clients were wealthy businessmen who arrived in horse-drawn carriages. Others were laborers who slipped in after dusk, still smelling of soot and sweat. Regardless of status, every man received the same careful treatment and the same promise that no details would leave the room. This equality created a curious form of loyalty. Rich or poor, all were vulnerable in the presence of illness, and all depended on the doctor's silence. The doctors themselves maintained a strict personal code. They destroyed notes, avoided keeping ledgers, and paid rent through intermediaries. Many did not advertise. Their names spread only through whispered recommendations exchanged between men who shared the same fear. Some doctors lived solitary lives, rarely appearing in public except to purchase supplies. Others maintained modest families who never knew the full extent of their work. Their quiet routines protected not only their patients, but also the delicate structure of the hidden medical world. Inside the clinics, the atmosphere often felt suspended, as though time slowed to accommodate the burden of confession. Lamps burned low, casting long shadows across shelves lined with glass bottles. The air smelled faintly of herbs, alcohol, and something metallic. Men sat rigid on wooden chairs, avoiding each other's eyes. When the doctor finally beckoned them forward, relief washed over them with startling force. The doorway behind the doctor symbolized a refuge, a place where illness was not moral failure, but a simple fact. Some doctors became so trusted that their names were spoken with reverence among those who needed them most. A man might lower his voice and mention the physician behind the apothecary on Turner Street, or the healer who worked behind the bathhouse in the Eastern District. These mentions were never casual. They were gifts, fragments of hope passed from one frightened man to another. In a world where disease isolated its victims, these referrals formed a quiet chain of solidarity. The irony lay in how closely their work approached legitimacy while remaining entirely outside official systems. They upheld ethics through silence, compassion through discretion, and order through trust. In doing so, they created a structure more reliable to their patients than the public hospitals that stood proudly in the city's main squares. Their reputations, carefully guarded and cautiously shared, became currency more valuable than any license or diploma. The reverence surrounding these discreet physicians revealed how desperately men sought caretakers who understood fear more intimately than pride. Yet each quiet visit strengthened a network built on secrets, drawing patients deeper into a medical world that existed alongside the one sanctioned by law. One corner of this world specialized in erasing evidence itself, offering forged papers and altered diagnoses to those who needed their past rewritten. In the deeper layers of the underground medical world, There existed a separate network dedicated not to healing the body, but to erasing the traces that illness left behind. These operations were discreet, fragile, and astonishingly well organized, shaped by the constant fear that a single written word could destroy a man's standing forever. For Victorian gentlemen who lived inside the rigid walls of reputation, removing evidence of their disease became as urgent as treating it. Some even considered the concealment more valuable than any medicine. The men who operated these networks were not always doctors. Some were clerks who worked in public hospitals, familiar with the ledgers where diagnoses were recorded. Others were assistants in private clinics who handled paperwork, or former medical students who had left their training before earning official titles. A few were apothecaries or printers who possessed the tools needed to mimic official documents. They performed their work in secluded rooms where the light was low, and the doors remained locked. For a gentleman seeking their services, the process was both simple and perilous. He approached through an intermediary, often a brothel keeper, a trusted apothecary, or a discreet friend who had once needed the same assistance. Direct contact was rare. The meeting usually occurred in a rented room above a shop, or in the quiet back space of a bathhouse where steam clouded the air. The gentleman explained what he wished to erase: a diagnosis, an entry in a ledger, the memory of a visit, or even the suspicion of illness entirely. In return, he received a forged medical certificate declaring him healthy, or a revised version of his previous diagnosis, rewritten in harmless terms. These papers carried immense power. Employers, family members, and even officials accepted them without question, trusting the authority implied by a doctor's signature. Few imagined that such documents could be fabricated. Victorian society placed tremendous faith in paper because it symbolized order. The underground network took advantage of this trust, producing documents that blended seamlessly into official records. I find it unsettling how much hope men placed in these fragile pieces of paper. They believed that altering a diagnosis could undo the past, that changing a few words could erase the consequences of their choices. Some clung to these documents as though they were shields, carrying them in their pockets or locking them inside small wooden boxes. The illusion of protection reassured them more than any actual medical treatment. Among the services offered, one of the most coveted was the complete removal of a name from hospital logs. This required cooperation from someone inside the institution, usually a clerk willing to risk his position. Under the cover of night, he would enter the records room, locate the entry, and blot it out with careful strokes. Sometimes he removed the page entirely, replacing it with a duplicate containing no trace of the original patient. The process had to be perfect. Any inconsistency could raise suspicion. When successful, the gentleman vanished from the hospital's history as though he had never set foot inside. These erasures became so common that some hospitals began noticing gaps in their ledgers, blank spaces where entries should have been, pages missing without explanation. Yet no one admitted publicly that such tampering occurred. Doing so would expose the institution's vulnerability, so administrators chose quiet ignorance instead. Their silence only made the underground operations more confident. In some cases, the networks extended to funeral parlors. When a man died from complications of venereal disease, families often requested that the cause be changed before the certificate was issued. Workers complied, replacing syphilis with fever or decline of health. These edits protected the family's dignity and ensured that the deceased would be remembered without shame. It was a final act of concealment, performed out of loyalty to social expectations. The most expensive service of all was the full erasure, a package that included forged papers, altered histories, removal from ledgers, and discreet follow-up visits to ensure consistency. Only wealthier clients could afford this level of secrecy. They walked away feeling cleansed, though their bodies still carried the illness. The underground healers knew this and often encouraged additional treatment. But many men declined, believing that a clean record mattered more than genuine recovery. This world of concealment thrived because Victorian society prized appearance over truth. Men feared disgrace more than suffering, and the networks exploited that fear to maintain their operations. The people involved saw themselves not as criminals but as protectors of fragile reputations. They believed they were offering a service the official system refused to provide. The delicate machinery of these concealment networks revealed how desperately men sought to rewrite their own histories when illness threatened their public lives. Yet each forged document pushed them further from the possibility of confronting their condition with honesty or proper care. Before long, the silence surrounding these hidden treatments extended even into death, creating graves filled with secrets, families never uncovered. There were countless Victorian men whose final moments carried more silence than breath, and whose graves held more truth than any room they had ever entered in life. They died quietly, leaving behind families who believed they had succumbed to something ordinary. Fever, exhaustion, or a sudden collapse of health. Yet the real cause remained hidden, locked behind the walls of underground clinics, folded inside private notebooks, or remembered only by a doctor who had long learned to treat knowledge as a dangerous burden. These men carried their secrets to the grave because secrecy, in their world, felt safer than confession. Many families never suspected anything. They looked at the body of a father, a brother, a son, pale and still, and accepted whatever the doctor wrote on the certificate. Illness, after all, was meant to be spoken of softly. Anything shameful was not spoken of at all. A man could have lived with months of pain, rashes, a tremors, and blindness creeping in at the edges. Yet the household believed he had simply been working too hard. It was easier for them to believe this. The structure of Victorian morality encouraged it. The underground doctors understood this pattern well. Over the years, they learned that the greatest loyalty expected of them was not skill, nor discretion during treatment, but silence after death. When a patient passed away, whatever record existed, letters, notes, small descriptions of symptoms, were neatly folded away or burned. Even the journals some doctors kept, filled with observations and experiments, were written in coded language that no outside reader could decipher. A single phrase might contain an entire story, but only the writer knew what it meant. These notebooks were never published, never shared, never placed in archives. They died the same way many of their patients did, concealed by intent. I often think about the weight that must have rested on those pages. They held not only medical observations but fragments of fear, desperation, and human frailty. Yet no one was permitted to see them. The doctors believed they were protecting their patients, even in death. And perhaps they were. But by sealing those stories away, they also erased a history of suffering that could have revealed far more about the era's hidden epidemics. Some of these physicians kept boxes of letters, requests for help, descriptions of bodily changes, pleas for secrecy. When a man died, the doctor often recognized the handwriting instantly. He would remove the letters, glance at them one last time, and then destroy them without hesitation. Burning was the preferred method. The smoke rose quietly, disappearing into the damp air of London evenings. The doctor watched in stillness as the only remaining proof of a man's fear crumbled into ash. It was a ritual that served both practicality and mercy. Families rarely questioned why certain details were missing. The Victorians were trained from childhood to avoid probing into matters considered private or disgraceful. A widow might stand at the foot of her husband's grave, clutching her gloves, unaware that the illness which took him had been eating at him for years. She accepted the official explanation because it preserved her dignity as well. To know the truth might have destroyed her social position, and she had already lost enough. In some cases, even the funeral workers played a quiet role in this concealment. They were accustomed to preparing bodies marked by late-stage disease. They washed away lesions, dressed the man in his finest suit, and arranged the limbs carefully so no one would see how thin he had become. What they witnessed stayed with them, but they spoke of it to no one. The body left the preparation room as a cleaner version of itself, ready to be mourned without scandal. Over time, the silence surrounding such deaths became so absolute that entire communities forgot how widespread these illnesses truly were. The epidemic existed in shadows, never openly acknowledged. Generations later, historians found gaps in medical records that made no sense. Missing diagnoses, incomplete files, and the sudden disappearances of patients. The absence itself revealed the truth, but only faintly. It is strange how final silence can be. In life, these men sought quick cures, secret consultations, forged papers, anything that promised relief without exposure. In death, they required nothing more than the promise that no one would learn what had actually happened to them. Silence became their final treatment, administered by doctors who understood that damaging the reputation of the dead could harm the living. The graves of these men held diseases no stone would ever confess, leaving families to grieve without understanding what had truly taken them. The doctors who knew the truth carried it like a second shadow, careful never to let it touch the world outside their rooms. In the end, what survived was not knowledge, but an emptiness shaped by fear, a silence that buried itself deeper than any coffin. Private clinics for Victorian men did not resemble the institutions one might imagine. They were quiet, unmarked rooms tucked behind respectable storefronts, dim stairwells, or cramped back corridors that had long stopped pretending to serve any other purpose. These places came alive only when the lamps of the city dimmed, and the respectable world retreated indoors. After official hours, when the ordinary patients had gone home, and the streets began to empty, a different kind of visitor approached. Gentlemen who carried their worries like a stain beneath their coats and sought a doctor who promised more silence than treatment. There were no signs, no plaques, no written advertisements. The only way to find these places was by knowing the right person, or by earning the kind of trust that men exchanged reluctantly, as though each word might incriminate them. A name passed in a low voice, a location mentioned only once, a set of stairs described so vaguely that only someone truly desperate would attempt to follow it. The system survived precisely because it was fragile. If too many people knew, it would collapse. If too few knew, it would die. But somehow, it balanced itself through fear. The doctors who operated these private rooms understood the rhythm of secrecy. Their official practice, if they had one, closed at a reasonable hour, with predictable calm. But after dusk, they unlocked other doors. These were the hours when they treated men who could not bear the exposure of a public waiting room. The consultations were brief, heavy, and always conducted with the understanding that nothing said or seen would exist outside those walls. The silence between doctor and patient felt like a pact formed not out of affection, but mutual danger. I sometimes imagine the atmosphere inside those rooms. Dust lingering on unused medical books. A single lamp illuminates the doctor's gloved hands. The faint smell of chemicals, half hidden beneath the scent of damp wool from the coats, hung near the door. The men who entered rarely looked up. Their footsteps were slow, as though the air itself resisted the truth they carried. In that dim light, their fear seemed sharper than any symptom they described. These after-hour clinics operated almost like private clubs. Exclusive, concealed, and strangely ceremonial. Each gentleman arrived, knowing exactly what was expected of him. There was no small talk, no unnecessary questions, no examination beyond what was strictly required. Payment was made discreetly. Sometimes before the consultation even began, the doctor did not count the money aloud. He simply folded it into a drawer and locked it. Everything felt rehearsed, yet no one ever spoke of it. The men who came late at night did not belong to a single class. Some were wealthy, dressed in fabrics too fine for the narrow staircase they climbed. Others were clerks, soldiers, or labourers who had saved for weeks simply to be allowed inside. Illness, in those hours, erased the distinctions society clung to during the day. The only thing that mattered was secrecy, and secrecy cost the same whether one lived in a townhouse or a tenement. These hidden clinics became essential as more men feared being recognised at public hospitals. The risk of humiliation outweighed the danger of untreated disease. A glance from a neighbour, a whisper from a nurse, a line written into a ledger. Any of these could destroy a man's standing in a community that prized moral purity above compassion. In the private rooms, however, he was not judged. He was simply another body seeking relief. Some doctors offered small comforts that did not exist in public institutions. A warm cloth, a chair is placed far from the window, a promise that no apprentice or assistant would be present. These gestures mattered. They reassured the men who believed they had fallen from grace and needed a place where their shame would not echo. Even so, the atmosphere remained cold. The walls absorbed fear more readily than warmth. The hours stretched long for the doctors as well. They bore the weight of stories they never wrote down, symptoms they recognized instantly, and outcomes they could not always improve. Yet they continued, night after night, because the demand never waned. The city was full of men who needed them. The underground network thrived, not because it was well designed, but because the alternative was unbearable. By dawn, the private clinics returned to their daytime silence. The lamps were blown out, the tools cleaned, the drawers locked. Anyone passing by would see nothing unusual, just an ordinary building settling into the morning fog. The traces of what had occurred during the night vanished completely, leaving behind no record except the exhaustion on the doctor's face and the relief or dread carried home by the men who slipped back into the waking world. These hidden rooms held the fears that men could not voice anywhere else, wrapped in the dim glow of secrecy that protected them more than any cure. The doctors who waited in those narrow spaces moved through the night as guardians of silence rather than healers of disease. Somewhere within that quiet exchange, a darker system grew stronger, fed not by medicine, but by the desperation that walked through unmarked doors. There were rooms in Victorian cities that did not exist on any blueprint. Rooms that refused to reveal themselves to anyone who approached without the proper signal. These places were not marked by numbers or names. Instead, they were identified through gestures passed quietly from one desperate man to another. A faint knock, a small pattern of taps on an unremarkable door, or the appearance of a familiar face acting as a silent escort. These were the keys that unlocked a world hidden beneath everyday respectability. To those who carried their secrets like a weight pressing into their ribs, these rooms offered something dangerously close to relief. The entrances were designed to blend into their surroundings. A back door behind a bakery, a narrow passage between two warehouses, a wooden panel in the corner of a church basement that only shifted when touched in a certain way. Anyone walking by would assume the spaces led to storage closets or unused hallways. The truth was known only to the men who needed them, and to the doctors who maintained their secrecy, as though the walls themselves might betray them if not kept in check. Inside, the air felt heavy, as though it carried the residue of every confession spoken there. Lamps cast low, amber light that reached only a small circle of the room, leaving the edges submerged in quiet shadow. A wooden chair is placed too close to a desk, a wash basin filled earlier in the day, the water still faintly rippling from its last use. Instruments arranged with clinical precision, yet dulled by the burden of what they were asked to confront. Nothing inside these rooms suggested comfort, but everything suggested necessity. Men who entered had already crossed a threshold long before they touched the hidden door. The moment they stepped across it, they ceased being symbols of moral uprightness and became simply bodies in urgent need of help. Their gloved hands trembled slightly as they removed their coats. Their eyes drifted toward the floor, unwilling to confront either the doctor or the reflection of their choices. The silence that greeted them was not judgmental. It was merely the blank space in which their fear could expand. There was a ritual to these encounters, though no one ever acknowledged it openly. A man arrived escorted or alone, performed the gesture that proved he belonged, stepped inside, and waited for the door to close behind him. The doctor observed quietly, letting the man's posture reveal the truth he could not speak. Shoulders drawn inward, breathing shallow. The subtle stiffness of someone who feared both the diagnosis and the shame surrounding it. In this secluded space, illness was stripped of morality. It became a fact, stark and cold, demanding to be named. Those who maintained these rooms understood the power they held. They were guardians of a fragile trust that society refused to offer. Outside, a man might be condemned by a single rumor. Inside, he could reveal the parts of himself that he kept hidden from his own family. The doctor's role extended far beyond treatment. He became a witness, a figure who absorbed the stories men carried into the room, then buried them as though they were part of the floorboards. The secrecy surrounding these rooms allowed them to exist without interruption. No inspector came knocking. No official ledger recorded the visitors. Everything moved through whispers between trusted individuals who respected the need for darkness. Even the patients understood the danger of speaking too freely. A misplaced word could unravel the entire system, leaving dozens of men exposed to the society that insisted their suffering was deserved. Some of these rooms operated only on certain nights, when the city's noise masked the arrival of visitors. Others opened briefly during early morning hours, before the streets filled with children on their way to school. Their limited schedules were deliberate. Too much activity would draw suspicion. Too little would create desperation. Maintaining the balance required discipline from everyone involved. The men who sought help often left with bandaged wounds, small bottles of medicine, or instructions delivered in low, steady tones. But more than that, they left with the sense that someone had seen them, truly seen them, in a way the world refused to. In those cramped spaces, their illnesses finally had names. Names stripped of morality. Names that belonged to science rather than shame. For a few quiet minutes, they existed not as cautionary tales, but as human beings in pain. Walking back into the street, the men blended once again into the passing crowds. Their coats buttoned, their hats lowered. Their pace was deliberate and unremarkable. No one around them suspected what door they had opened or what fear they had carried inside. The secret rooms swallowed their stories whole, leaving the world above untouched. These hidden spaces revealed how easily morality collapsed when illness demanded a place to hide, leaving men suspended between fear and the faint promise of mercy. The doctors within those walls learned to read suffering with an accuracy born from years of quiet observation. Somewhere deeper in the network, doors existed that required more than a knock. Doors that guarded the most forbidden forms of treatment. Men dared not speak aloud. The slow unraveling of the hidden medical world did not begin with a scandal or a confession. It began within the bodies of the men who once placed their trust in secrecy. What they carried into those dim back rooms followed them out again, settling quietly into their muscles, nerves, and blood like a residue that refused to fade. Years later, long after the urgency of their illness had been pushed aside, the consequences rose to the surface with a calmness more frightening than the disease itself. Some men first noticed it in the mornings, when lifting themselves from bed required more effort than they expected. A stiffness that clung to their joints, a faint tremor that ran through the fingers, a heaviness in the chest that came and went without pattern. None of these symptoms arrived loudly, but together they marked the slow decay left behind by rushed treatments. and misdiagnoses whispered through locked doors. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. Mercury remedies, once offered as miracle cures in the shadows, left deep scars on those who swallowed them. Teeth loosened over time, gums darkened, and exhaustion seeped into daily life. Other men experienced quieter collapse, blurred vision, a sudden weakness in the legs, or erratic moods that doctors later described as nervous disorders. All of it stemmed from choices made in desperation, shaped by fear of exposure more than any genuine hope of healing. Chronic venereal diseases grew unchecked behind the veil of secrecy, because few cases were ever recorded honestly. Hospitals and medical institutions failed to grasp how widespread the damage truly was. The infections progressed unseen, transforming into long-term conditions that altered marriages, households, and even bloodlines. Yet official records remained deceptively clean, as if the suffering had never existed. Silence became the most powerful ingredient in the epidemic. Within homes, wives fell ill without understanding why. Miscarriages, fevers, and lasting weakness appeared without explanation. Husbands avoided the truth by burying it beneath routine. The women, unaware of what had been passed to them, blamed themselves. In some families, children were born with fragile health, limps, deformities, or unexplained cognitive decline. These outcomes were accepted as misfortune rather than traced back to the secret encounters that shaped them. Lineages weakened over generations. Businesses faded when successors inherited bodies already worn down by untreated disease. Estates moved to distant relatives because the direct heirs were too sick to manage them. The polite fiction maintained by Victorian society that immorality alone brought illness made it impossible for families to speak openly about what destroyed their stability. The cost of silence became woven into family histories. Unspoken, yet unmistakable. Research suffered as well. Physicians lacked accurate data, observing only fragments of the larger picture. Their journals described symptoms that seemed disconnected, never linking them to the broader network of clandestine treatments. Breakthroughs that might have arrived sooner were delayed by years because so much information remained hidden. Victorian morality shaped not only individual lives, but the trajectory of medical progress itself. In later years, many men lived with quiet resignation. They learned to pace themselves, conserving strength for public moments while collapsing into private stillness afterwards. Some adopted steady routines to mask their decline: familiar walking paths, early evenings, predictable habits, but their bodies eventually betrayed them. A stagger on the church steps, a moment of confusion over a simple task, a sudden, unexplained collapse during an ordinary afternoon. Those around them noticed but remained silent out of habit, preserving the same secrecy that caused the harm. Social reputation had once driven them into hidden rooms. Now that same fear prevented them from speaking about the slow erosion of their health. The shame that had shaped their treatment became the barrier that prevented them from seeking real help. They moved through life bearing unspoken regrets. Regrets for choices made in panic, for illnesses denied too late, and for the families harmed by what they never dared to admit. The harsh truth was that many of these consequences could have been avoided, had men been able to seek open, legitimate care without fear of moral judgment. Much of their suffering might have been prevented. Instead, the long-term damage became a quiet monument to a society that valued appearance over truth. The price of secrecy extended far beyond the moment of illness. It carved itself into generations, leaving traces that historians still struggle to fully understand. These long shadows revealed how silence allowed disease to grow unnoticed, shaping entire families in ways they never recognized. The hidden cost of secrecy weighed more heavily than any whispered treatment that once promised relief. A deeper chamber of this world still waits, holding a truth that few ever reached without losing something of themselves. Standing at the distant edge of Victorian medical history, One quickly notices how deceptively calm the surface appears. Hospitals rising in neat rows, new instruments displayed with pride, and confident lectures delivered in halls filled with young men eager to call themselves physicians. Yet beneath that polished exterior lies a world shaped not by clarity but by concealment. The era wrapped itself tightly in the belief that progress alone defined it, leaving the darker truths to settle quietly in the corners no one wished to illuminate. Victorian society preferred the illusion of cleanliness, moral, medical, and social. People spoke endlessly of discipline and purity, but both ideas faltered under the weight of private fears. Men who carried symptoms of sexual illness did not imagine themselves as patients. They imagined themselves as potential scandals. Every choice they made, every step toward treatment, became an attempt to manage shame rather than sickness. Progress could be admired publicly, yet privately. The same society built hidden corridors that functioned as its real medical backbone. In those back rooms, medicine became a negotiation rather than a science. A man did not ask what procedure he needed. He asked whether the doctor could be trusted not to speak his name. Silence, not skill, determined value. Some doctors possessed both, and they became legends whispered about in gentlemen's clubs. Figures who operated behind shuttered windows, behind apothecaries, behind bathhouses, and in small annexes attached to places of worship. Their anonymity was not a flaw, but a feature that allowed them to serve those who feared official scrutiny more than the disease consuming their bodies. Public medicine, proud and authoritative, demanded adherence to moral purity. Private medicine, hidden and imperfect, catered to the human realities that public institutions refused to acknowledge. The result was a parallel world where treatments were exchanged in hushed voices, symptoms described indirectly, and payment served as both medical fee and protective shield. Men entered these secret chambers not as patients, but as fugitives from their own reputations. Inside homes, the consequences of silence grew heavier. Family members noticed the trembling hands, the brittle skin, the unsettling fatigue, yet learned never to question too directly. Conversations about health dissolved into vague comments, pose, or forced optimism. A man could be dying quietly in the next room, but as long as no one spoke the words aloud, the family maintained the fragile illusion that nothing shameful was occurring. Denial became a kind of household etiquette. Physicians who operated in the public sphere also became participants in this culture of concealment. Some reluctantly, others enthusiastically. Some doctors knew precisely what disease stood behind their patients' symptoms, but softened the language for the sake of preserving appearances. Some weaponized charging exorbitant fees because they understood how desperately men clung to anonymity. For many, healing was secondary to protecting themselves from judgment. When death came, it did so quietly. Certificates were written with careful euphemisms: fever, or fatigue, lung weakness, or other harmless-sounding causes that obscured the truth. Families accepted these explanations because they were gentler, easier to live with, and more convenient to repeat. The body was committed to the ground, the truth sealed with it. Records remained clean, reputations intact, and society continued the performance of moral purity. This system of secrecy allowed Victorian Britain to maintain its decorum while ignoring the suffering that decorum created. It allowed officials to claim excellence in public health, while the most vulnerable men navigated a chaotic, unregulated, and often dangerous medical underworld. It allowed moralists to condemn behavior publicly while privately relying on the very networks they criticized. And it allowed families to claim respectability while never confronting the realities that shaped their loved ones' lives. The true weight of this history lies not only in the number of men lost to inadequate treatment, but in the cultural expectation that suffering should remain hidden. Silence became the first antidote, secrecy the second, and misinformation the third. Many of the era's medical advancements grew atop the buried experiences of men whose conditions were never acknowledged in daylight. Even now, reading through surviving notes, journals, and municipal records, one senses not absence but deliberate omission. Pages that should contain detailed accounts instead offer vague summaries. Margins remain blank where a diagnosis should stand. The silence is not accidental, it is structural. It is the final layer of a society that chose to preserve its image rather than confront its failures. This hidden landscape raises an unsettling realization. Victorian medicine did not progress cleanly from ignorance to knowledge. It progressed by burying its missteps, disguising its fears, and shaping its own narrative through omission. The cost of that narrative was paid by men who died unnamed, untreated, or misunderstood. Their suffering formed the invisible architecture beneath the official story of medical triumph. And yet, amid all this darkness, there is a harsh clarity. These secret medical pathways existed because people feared exposure more than illness. The networks survived precisely because they answered a need that public institutions refused to acknowledge. As long as the official world demanded purity, the unofficial world provided the only available refuge. To imagine the final scene of this hidden history, one must picture a narrow room lit by a single weak flame. A man seated with his head lowered, coins in one hand and dread in the other. Outside, the city glitters with its own certainty, believing itself advanced and civilized. Inside, he waits for the quiet footstep of the doctor, who will treat him without judgment, without paperwork, and without leaving a trace behind. It is in this small, dim space, not the hospital ward, that the truth of Victorian medicine truly resides. This closing glimpse of a silent world reveals how progress often rested on what people refused to name aloud. The deeper these hidden rooms were used, the more they shaped lives that never reached official history. Somewhere beyond the written record lies a final truth that those men carried alone into the dark. Thank you for staying with this story until its quiet end, for walking through the shadowed corners of a world that preferred to hide its wounds. May your night be soft, your rest steady, and your thoughts settle gently after this long journey through forgotten histories. Good night.